1. Vincent. Vincent Barnes was perpetuating stereotypes, and he knew it. Any vampire with a firmly placed moral backbone would tell him that sneaking into a stranger's home to drink their blood while they slept was rude, illegal, and, above all, a terrible portrayal of the vampiric community. The problem was, back when Vincent had associated with the vampiric community, none of those vampires had turned out to have a moral backbone, and Vincent was starving. Dealers of bagged blood charged as much as rent, which he already couldn't afford, and existed in tight black market clichés he didn't have the social prowess to hunt down. Seducing some drunk fool into letting him have a quick nibble went far beyond the limits of his flirting expertise. Straight up attacking a human in a back alley? Vincent could feel his panic rising just thinking about it, not to mention all the other terrible vampire stereotypes it would perpetuate. So that left home invasion, the vampiric equivalent of that old game show with the doors. What's behind door number 1? An empty bed, or an elderly lady wearing 3 bottles of perfume, or an angry naked fireman with an axe? Vincent hadn't realized it was possible to have horny nightmares, but after the fireman encounter, he didn't sleep through the day for a month. He stared at the small suburban house he'd chosen for tonight, and hoped for a slightly less angry, less axe-murderous, abs-bared fireman behind tonight's door. With its 3-bedroom floor plan and tight side yard, it didn't look like much, but it sat just far enough back from the aging street lamps that its deep shadows and ancient locks made it a perfect game show-style hunting ground. Vincent's door in question was technically a large second-story window, with a slightly bowing screen and an incredibly tiny ledge outside. If he'd been any taller than 5'9", he wouldn't have fit. With one bare foot curled around the sill, and the other wedged into a lump in the stucco, he fiddled with the screen. The fraying strings of his fingerless gloves dangled in the starlight, and he flicked his head to dislodge a chunk of shaggy hair from his eyes as, with a final finessed pop, the screen slid free. His bare feet made only the softest rustle as he lowered himself inside. The gentle swish of his dark clothes blended into the white noise of the distant highway. He breathed slow and deep, waiting for the first sign of a twitch in the night. Despite the moonless sky, Vincent could clearly make out the room's contents in his monochromatic night vision. An open closet revealed a tornado of clothing. The desk and dresser held a cluttering of books, games, and other knickknacks. A collage of photos had been pasted across the far wall, and halfway between the window and the door was a queen-sized bed bearing Vincent's prey like a silver platter, a single human soundly asleep beneath the blankets. The man's pillow was bunched underneath him, his head already tipped to reveal the crest of his neck below the lazy curls that flicked around his ears. This was, undeniably, the best door of the month. As Vincent stepped closer, he corrected himself. This was the best door ever, or at least since Vincent had become a vampire during his first and only semester of college 4 years prior. Even the most average humans, those who took regular showers and didn't wear cologne to bed, all tasted and smelled a bit different. In most cases, different meant a unique brand of mediocre. But Vincent could already tell this particular human's blood would be absolutely delicious. He even smelled delicious. The scent wasn't like something, not sandalwood or fresh bread or motor oil, but the natural musk of him was better than any signature fragrance, a dark, lovely aroma that urged Vincent to press his nose to the man's skin and just breathe. The thought almost made him turn tail and run. He was here, breaking into people's homes while they slept, because not doing so would mean starvation, and eventually death. He was not here to creepily think about how wonderful they smelled while staring at their perfect cheekbones and the gentle flutter of their long lashes, and, oh God, he was still fawning over this complete stranger. Vincent pressed his lips together and steadied his thoughts. Feed and get out. Feed and get out. He eased his weight slowly onto the mattress to reach the delicious man. Feed and get out, Vincent repeated. Feed and get out. The scrappy edges of his long jacket hung threateningly, and he held them back as he leaned over the sleeping human. His fangs slipped from above his canines as instinct moved him toward the juiciest curve of the man's neck. After the initial break-in, this was the most precarious part of the act. If he could nick his prey's skin with just the right dose of venom, then the neurological effect would keep the human slumbering peacefully through the feeding. If the human woke at the first touch of teeth, though, both of them would be in for a wild time, one that usually involved a lot of screaming and throwing things on the human's part, and a rapid relocation to another neighborhood on Vincent's. Vincent's hair fell back into his eyes as he lowered his mouth to the human's neck. He indulged himself with one long, deep breath of the man's scent before piercing his fangs through the man's skin. The man made a little involuntary sound, soft and low, and continued sleeping. The tension slipped from Vincent's shoulders. He settled a little more deeply onto the mattress, propping one arm against the back of the man's head. Oh, God, his hair was so soft. Feed and get out. Feed and get out. You can do this. Vincent drank. Becoming a vampire had given him a healthy craving for blood, regardless of the flavor. Usually, blood tasted all right. There were exceptions. Humans so far out of Vincent's palate range that it made them disgustingly flat, or so far into it that each swallow was like a hearty dessert. But blood wasn't supposed to taste this good, he was pretty sure. Nothing was supposed to taste this good. The man's blood was rich and dark and sweet, like his scent, but in the form of the best quality maple syrup, the kind Vincent's mom used to buy, and probably still bought, but duskier, as though it had been turned into whiskey or bourbon, but without the bite of hard liquor. Vincent forced himself to drink slowly, to savor each drop. When he left this room, that would be it. No repeats, no returns. That was the rule he'd set for himself when he'd finally broken down and jiggled free the lock of his first door. If he was going to take blood from humans who couldn't consent, he would at least not go to the same ones over and over again. He wasn't going to be the stereotypical vampire who stalked a human like it was some kind of game. But fucking hell, this particular human was going to make that rule difficult. Vincent continued to drink, not quite curled against the man's back, but not quite not curled against him either, until his mind buzzed with the initial signals of overindulgence. That was one thing the stereotypes got entirely wrong. It was hard to drain a human to the point of death. Hard physically because the average adult body contained multiple liters of blood, and hard psychologically because murder was still murder. And hard because it went against the vampire's natural instinct to keep the human alive so they'd produce more blood for the next meal. But Vincent wasn't coming back to this meal, no matter how tasty. He repeated this to himself as he withdrew his fangs and pressed his tongue to the side of the human's neck until he felt the skin close up. He repeated it as he checked that the wound had vanished, gently patting the area clean with his sleeve, the taste of that amazing blood slowly vanishing from his tongue. He repeated it again as he slipped out the window, leaving behind the man's frustratingly wonderful scent. No more feeding on this particular human. One time was all he got. He stopped repeating the thought around late morning, as he finally drifted off to sleep, still thinking of the man's taste, his smell, his dark curls, and gentle sounds of slumber. A week and a half of bland and bitter blood later, Vincent broke his rule of no returns. He went back for seconds. 2. Wesley. Wesley Louise Smith Garcia was perpetuating stereotypes. Again. Dude, there's no fucking way. I'm too young and hot to waste my life in a cubicle for the next 40 years. Damn it. I auto-spawned in the 4th quadrant again. Are you close enough to back me? Wes kicked his leg over the couch's armrest as he leaned forward, controlling his avatar into a dive roll behind a broken wall. Over his headset, Kendall cursed. Nah, I'm pinned down, she grumbled. You know most regular jobs aren't all that bad, right? I mean, the starting pay is pretty crap, and you do not want to see my health insurance bills, and no matter how much turnover we have, there's always someone exploding their lunch in the microwave, but the steady income is nice. Are you buying anniversary presents for your retirement fund now? At least I have one. A gentle barrage of pistol noises came through Kendall's side, followed by another curse. As if on cue, a red flare burst from Wes's fictional head, his avatar falling to the ground. The respawn screen appeared. He deployed again, triggering his avatar to huskily shout, "I'm always up for the hunt," as an explosion echoed in the background. I'm not against getting a job, okay? I just want to like what I do. You, Wesley, want to be in love with what you do. You want it to give you fluttery heart feelings and raise your dick at night, which is why you need a girlfriend. Or a boyfriend. You have so many options. At this very moment, you could be out falling in love with literally anyone. That's literally not what bisexuality means, and you know it, Wes grumbled. I thought you were grilling me about jobs, not partners. It's a 2-for-1. I'll start grilling you about finding a new best friend, too, if you don't get your ass over to that last house. Wes glanced at the second, smaller monitor beside his primary TV, where Kendall's screen was currently streaming. A video of her face took up its corner, her dark skin a little shiny, and her short hair with its bleached tips sticking up at all angles from running her left hand through it every time she died. She would always complain that the habit fluffed up her rigorously straightened natural curls, but she never stopped doing it. Wes hadn't seen the act in person since they'd both graduated 12 months ago and moved back to their respective hometowns, but after 3.5 years as roommates, he had cataloged it at every possible angle in almost every possible situation. Right, fine, I'm coming. But you can't claim I'm stealing your assist this time. This is practically charity work I'm doing here. Just kill that damn vamp on the roof for me already? Bet I can clear the whole house before you get here. Kendall grinned. $5 says you can't. You're stacking yourself against some terrible odds here, you know that. I can spare the cash. Unlike some people, I have a job, therefore I receive money. I hate you, Kendall, Wes shouted and charged the vamp-laden house. The game vampires had red eyes, blood blurred along their lips, and a sickly pallor to their skin that Wes was pretty sure went beyond the typical lack of tan that haunted most vamps in real life. Not that he'd seen many outside the occasional news spotlight or viral social media post, though he was also pretty sure some of those vampires were just regular people looking for attention. In the game, they flailed once as he shot silver bullets through their skulls, their bodies collapsing into pools of unnaturally dark blood that remained after their corpses flickered out. Wes ran through his gun's ammunition and switched to stakes for the last 2 vamps. His health dropped to 5% as the last one of them caught him with a bite to the arm, but he killed the vamp before it could drain anything more from him. "Mission successful," popped across the screen. Wes hollered, letting the game save before tossing down his controller. He bounced from the couch to flip off the console. With the screens black, the house went dark, but he didn't bother with the lights on as he crossed the living room to the kitchen. His phone reconnected him to his video call with Kendall after a momentary lag. Wes smirked, despite knowing he'd only be a flimsy shadow on his friend's screen. $5? $5, Kendall replied, but only once you pick something to apply for, or someone. That wasn't part of the wager. Wes leaned his head against the side of the fridge, letting the light wash him in fluorescent tones. It's just, I'm not ready. It's been over a year, Wes. For how softly Kendall said it, it still hurt like a punch to the gut. Most people didn't take this long to grieve, Wes knew, but most people didn't come home from college to find their mother had vanished the week prior. Most people didn't have to lower her empty coffin into the ground alone, while their mother's homophobic extended family demanded to know why they hadn't been invited, and their father sent his regards in the form of a note card, with their stepfamily's names neatly printed in swirly cursive. Most people understood how and when and why their loved one had died. Wesley only knew where, and it was a place he couldn't seem to get into. Dwelling on that fact felt like breaking apart piece by agonizing piece, his soul crumbling to the size of bullets that he might shoot straight through the hearts of those responsible for his mom's death. He was pretty sure he wouldn't live through the process, so he tried to shove the emotion right back where it had come from. "OJ goes with vodka, right?" he joked, staring into the fridge. Kendall seemed to take that as a bad sign. "I'm sorry, dude. I'm pushing, and I shouldn't be. I just worry about you." She sighed, running her hand through her hair. "You know the spare room at Leonie's and my place is always open if you need it." "It's fine. I've got the house." It was only luck that his mother had just transferred the property into his name before her disappearance. Luck, or the knowledge that something terrible could happen to her at the fucking asshole pharmaceutical company that was Vitalis-Barron. "I'm good here." He took a long guzzle of orange juice straight from the carton and slammed the door behind him. The magnets rattled. He grimaced. "You owe me $5. "Sending now." Wes made his way upstairs. The dark of the house was nothing compared to the 15 years of knowledge he had of the place. 15 years of just him and his mom, both of them loud enough to make the small home feel full. It never felt that way anymore. But it was paid off, and it was his. And if somehow his mother hadn't died the way he theorized, then this was where she'd come back to. Not that she would come back. She was dead. Wes knew that. But he still had to see the evidence for himself, and get the proof of it in his own hands, and use that proof to burn the people responsible to the ground. His phone beeped and he clicked the notification. Kendall's image turned to a little side icon as the money transfer app appeared. At the top sat the $5 from her, followed by the back and forth of a dozen other wagers from that week alone. He swiped away, scrolling mindlessly through his other open apps, and ended up in his emails, staring at his only bolded message. The subject line, "Job offer follow-up," with the preview of, "Wesley Smith, we look forward to seeing you again." He'd opened it dozens of times by now, but his vision still tunneled with each new attempt, and he turned it back to unread so fast that he hadn't gotten through the first paragraph yet. It had been so much easier interacting with them in person, where the constant action and reaction of an adrenaline-inducing conversation had blocked out the rest of his emotions and let his natural charisma shine. But while charisma alone might have gotten him the initial offer, there was still one more thing they wanted from him. "I do have one job I'm looking at." Wes mentioned it as casually as he could manage. He couldn't tell Kendall that he was only trying to get the position in order to rip the company up from its foundations and hurl it into the sun. Kendall might have been his best friend, but it still felt too ridiculous to say, "Hey, I'm convinced the largest pharmaceutical company in the country killed my mom, but they won't let me into their top-secret research center unless I work for them." Especially when the only proof he had was a flyer for their research he'd found tucked into her bedside book, her complaints of falling ill 2 months before, and the fact that a bus ticket had been purchased with her card on the assumed day of her disappearance. His mother hated buses, so much that she'd thrown a party when the train system that passed through the city had added a new line. Someone had bought the bus ticket as a cover-up. Someone with funds and slightly dangerous research opportunities that his mom had taken an interest in when the symptoms of her illness lingered. Someone Wes was going to ruin, if only he could get that far. "I already had an interview, actually. They seemed to like me." He also didn't add that he'd applied with his father's last name to minimize his connection to his mom, or that "liked him" had been an understatement when he'd nailed all 3 of their grueling interviews.
"Dude, that's awesome!"
Kendall beamed at him.
"Why didn't you say something earlier?"
It probably won't work out. It's for a sales kind of deal with that big research company that's always trying to recruit new volunteers, Vitalis-Barron. Except I'd be the one recruiting, and the volunteers they want most right now are vampires.
Shit, so you'd have to what, single out vampires and convince them to do medical research?
Something like that. The shine of the interviewer's teeth was engraved in his mind as she leaned toward him, smiling in a way that sent chills down his spine.
Our research participants are all volunteers, but we know that research of this kind can be intimidating. Sometimes participants need a little pressure to get through the doors. Once they're inside and touring our facilities, though, it's rare they leave.
Well, Wes sure knew a little something about people going into Vitalis-Barron Pharmaceutical and not leaving. Right now, they seemed to be focusing their attention on vamps and not humans. But how long would it be before their focus swept back toward single mothers with absent children? Like I said, I probably won't get it. Their job offer has a clause where they'll only accept me if I can prove I've got what it takes, by signing up a vamp for them first. Wes flipped on the light in the bathroom and propped his phone against the mirror, shoving his toothbrush into his mouth dry.
You know it's shit that they're asking you to do unpaid labor, right?
Yeah, I know. Wes popped out his toothbrush, leaning both elbows down to the counter to flick the tip in Kendall's direction. It's probably why their entry-level salaries are so high. That, and their plethora of highly illegal and totally despicable research practices. Wes's gut boiled. He just had to get in there. Had to prove it. Where the hell do I find a vampire on my own, though? Knowing Vitalis-Barron's dirty secrets, he wanted it to be a vamp who deserved that fate. Not some poor fool who just happened to get a bad bite and was doing his best not to hurt anyone. But the violent sort of vampires that always made the news. That seemed to be most of them, if the media could be believed. Though Wes had seen enough of his country's finest journalism about humans of his own Hispanic heritage to know the media was as reliable as a gossiping ant when it came to accurate portrayals of anyone they didn't want as their neighbors. That would all be beside the point if he couldn't find any vampires in the first place. I looked up stats, and the predicted number of vampires in San Salud was between 2,000 and 7,500. Like, fuck, man, if the experts don't even know how to find the vampires to count them, what am I supposed to do? He shoved his toothbrush back in his mouth at the end of the question, brushing so hard his dentist was probably getting goosebumps. The massive collection of beads wrapping up his wrist jangled.
Hang out in the inner city? Kendall suggested. That's where most of them live, right?
And poke my head into every alley hoping that I happen to spot one with their fangs out?
Or you could go to a bar wearing a revealing shirt and touch your neck a lot. Janice claimed she picked up 3 different vampires that way. Maybe you'll find a job and a date.
Janice claimed she was a secret descendant of Marie Antoinette, Wes retorted, trying not to think about the time he'd stumbled into their complex's back entrance at 4 a.m., somehow already hungover while still half drunk, and seen a pretty pale boy with blood on his lips and his mouth against Janice's neck. She'd looked so enraptured, relaxed and blissful and serene. The vision still haunted Wes sometimes. Late at night, when it seemed the only thing that could let him finally fall asleep would be an orgasm. He rinsed his toothbrush and dropped it back into the cup, trying not to look like he was hastily burying a multi-year sex fantasy. Kendall at least seemed preoccupied with something that wasn't his expression.
What's that on your neck?
Wes scowled at his reflection. He examined his tanned skin, his curls bobbing as he turned his face back and forth. Sure enough, a tiny mark marred the side of his neck. And was that another just above it? Wesley's blood went cold and hot all at once. But they couldn't be. He was overthinking this. They're just little bruises. Now that he was thinking, he was pretty sure some slight discoloration had been there on and off the last couple weeks. I probably did something stupid in my sleep.
Knowing you, definitely.
Beneath the forced humor, she sounded almost worried.
You sure they're not fang marks or something?
You're only saying that because we're talking about vampires. But they were the right distance apart, and the right general area. Wes laughed. That would mean a vamp is sneaking into my bed at night, which is ridiculous. You'd think I'd know if someone was in my bed.
I'd know. You'd be wildly oblivious until 10 minutes after you'd already come.
That's unfair, Wes protested. A little overdramatically, maybe, but the situation seemed to call for it.
Not if it's true. In sophomore year, you didn't think to ask if Mel was into you until you'd already spent a full week sticking things up each other's.
I regret ever telling you about that. Though he didn't regret the experimenting, or the orgasms that came with it, even if its subsequent dating attempt had failed miserably, or anything from my sex life, for that matter. I'm abandoning our friendship in favor of the shower. Thank you very much. He picked up the phone, but his eyes flicked back to the mirror, to the marks on his neck. He had to stop thinking about them. We still on for tomorrow?
I was going to take Leonie to see this new romance adventure movie that came out last weekend.
Abandoning me for your girlfriend?
You could go and get your own girlfriend, or boyfriend, she added. In between friend, neither friend. Whoever makes you tingly in your—
I'm hanging up now.
Pingly.
Kendall managed to get in before her video officially closed out. Wes's screen turned back to his usual background picture of them from college, Kendall with her tongue stuck out and him smooching her cheek. Wes shook his head and laughed. As he stripped and started the shower, he couldn't get the thought of vampires out of his head. If, by some crazy turn of fate, there was one actually biting him in his sleep, then that would be terrifying and dangerous. And lucky. A message pinged on his Griffin chat app. Kendall Canoodles.
Dude, if there is a mystery neck-numbing vampire, then I wager $100 that you can't get them to go with you to that research job thing.
Lord of the Wind. Deal. 3. Wesley. Wesley turned off the light, scrunched his pillow under his chin, and closed his eyes. Sleep didn't come. In the back of his head, Kendall's bet returned. You'd think I'd know if someone was in my bed. Both of them understood just how unlikely this was. But Kendall had still wagered $100, and Wes had still accepted. It wasn't as though vampires weren't known for this kind of thing, for stealing blood in the dead of night, whether from sleeping victims or lonely travelers, or blood banks already struggling to find enough donations for their human patients. It wasn't entirely impossible. Wasn't his window screen looking a little more bowed than usual? Hadn't he been sleeping in later, waking up a bit groggier some mornings? Wes shuddered from the top of his head to his toes. He didn't believe the rumor that bites could randomly turn humans into vamps. If that were the case, he figured far more vampires would lurk the streets at night. But being bitten in his sleep, without his consent, was still a terrifying form of assault. Maybe it wasn't deadly research-level cruel, but it was up there. And it was exactly what Wes needed. A vampire willing to commit these crimes was someone he'd have no regrets turning over to Vitalis-Barron for the chance to take them down. It was almost too perfect, in fact. Like the universe had aligned this for him because it knew Vitalis-Barron had to be dealt with. As the night wore on, Wes's mind couldn't quite seem to shut off. Every creak and bump in the night flared like a firework behind his eyes, jolting him out of a half-sleep. It was all in his head, he told himself. Just his worries slipping into his dreams. Those, too, were filled with vampires and the dark, things that were half visions and half his own imagination, just conscious enough to be lucid. While there were probably no vampires coming for him, he couldn't stop himself from picturing what it might be like to encounter one now, vulnerable in bed. It would be the swish of dark fabric spilling through the window, eyes tracking along his sleeping form, the shift of the bed as a monster joined him, something hungry coming for him because it wanted him, because it needed him. A gentle breath on his neck, shivering down his spine, fingers touching his hair, winding into it, holding him in place, his life in the hands of a stranger, an adrenaline rush that no amount of gambling with Kendall could ever match. Lips on his skin, the prick of fangs.